Ladies and gentlemen, please, if you have cell phones, switch them off. It is my pleasure and my honor this evening to introduce Rupert Sheldrake. Somebody's in the front seat on the phone. That's cool.
Thank you.
Rupert and I have known each other for a number of years, but in January 2013, we both appeared at a now rather notorious TEDx conference in London, following which, after being online for a few days, both our talks mysteriously vanished. Setting in motion a discussion that went worldwide that we had not expected or anticipated. It was funny, really. I mean, TED, they wanted to shut us up by taking us offline, but they had the opposite effect in doing that. Now, actually, the talks that we gave were very different, but I think the one area that they had in common, which particularly got under Ted's skin, was the notion of non-local consciousness, that consciousness may not be simply an artifact or an epiphenomenon of brain activity, that it may be more mysterious and more complex than that. I am simply a writer, a journalist, but Rupert's a real scientist. And here's the interesting thing. Rupert has brought his real scientific discipline to the investigation of problems and mysteries that most so-called real scientists wouldn't touch with a barge pole. And that's exactly what we need. We need scientists with the courage to bring rigor and discipline to the investigation of the mysteries that surround us all. And Rupert's work over many decades has been of, I would say, incredible importance in bringing forth rational and focused discussion on these key areas which so often are the subject of rather woolly and not thoroughly thought through discussions. And I want to pay tribute to Rupert for that. Now, Rupert's known for Rupert's most recent book is actually called The Science Delusion in Britain, but here in America they gave it the title Science Set Free. It's called The Science Delusion in Britain in a wry reference to the Pope of materialist science, Richard Dawkins, who wrote a book called The God Delusion. But I think Science Set Free works really well as a title. Rupert's also written The Presence of the Past. He's written a very intriguing book called The Sense of Being Stared At. Morphic resonance, of course, is the subject for which Rupert is most widely known, perhaps. And then an intriguing title here, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. Well, actually, that's a really important issue, because if dogs know when their owners are coming home and there are, in fact, no cues to enable them to have that information, then they're breaking the so-called laws of physics and the laws of materialist science. And these are precisely the kind of problems we need to be investigating. And Rupert is the man who's investigating them and doing them with rigor and with intelligence and with imagination. And it's my pleasure to introduce him, Rupert Sheldrake.
Well, thank you, Graham. And thank you, Gary, and all the people who've made this gathering happen. It's been a huge amount of work, I know. Well, the science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. And this is a very widespread belief in our society. In fact, it's the kind of pre-installed belief system of most educated people. The educational system gives that impression. And of course, the sciences have been extraordinarily successful. we've all benefited from modern medicine. We all got here because of cars and planes and transport systems that work. Most people have mobile telephones, cell phones. Nearly all of us use computers and the internet. This is hugely impressive, and it rightly impresses everybody in the world. There's hardly anyone in the world who's not aware of these transformations wrought through science and its technological applications. So what could possibly be wrong with it? Well, it works very well in certain areas, extremely well, but the science as we know it is based on a set of assumptions that became built in to the scientific worldview between the 17th and the 19th centuries. It's essentially founded on a basis of dogmatic assumptions which have hardened into almost unquestioned beliefs. Most people who believe in science and who believe in the scientific worldview, which is in effect the philosophy of materialism, don't actually realize that they're believing in a worldview. They think other people have beliefs, but they know the truth. And this is one of the problems in dealing with people who have been thoroughly indoctrinated with the materialist worldview. They just don't realize it's actually a worldview or a philosophy of nature. They think it's factually the truth. There are 10 fundamental assumptions or dogmas on which the modern sciences are based. And what I do in my book, Science Set Free, is take these 10 dogmas and turn them into questions and look at them scientifically to see how well they stand up to scientific scrutiny. The answer is that none of them do. Every single one of them turns out to be on foundations of sand. Once you question them, they crumble. And what happens when you do that is that the sciences open up. All sorts of new lines of research come forward. I'm not anti-science, I'm pro-science. I think we need more science, not less, but I think that the science we have should be more scientific, not less scientific, more rational, not less rational. And one of the problems is that the defenders of so-called science and reason have become so unscientific and so unreasonable. What I'm going to do this evening is first run through these 10 doctrines, and then I'm going to discuss a couple of them. I don't have time to do more in one evening, but I shall be doing more on Sunday evening and in my workshop on Monday. The first of these 10 dogmas, which was the foundation of science as we know it, established in the 17th century, is that nature is mechanical. The universe is like a machine. Animals and plants are machines. We're machines too, lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' phrase. Our brains are like genetically programmed computers. Our hearts are like pumps. We're basically mechanisms. The second assumption is that matter is unconscious, and that everything in the universe is essentially unconscious. Everything's made of matter, and matter's unconscious. Third assumption, the laws of nature are fixed. They're the same everywhere and always, and have been exactly the same since the moment of the Big Bang. And the constants are fixed too, which is why they're called constants. Fourth assumption, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, except at the moment of the Big Bang when it all suddenly appeared. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nowhere in a single instant. The fifth assumption is that nature's purposeless. There's no purpose in universal evolution. There's no purpose in biological evolution. There's no purpose in life. There's no purpose in anything. As somebody once said recently about Richard Dawkins' purpose in life is to convince other people they have no purpose. This assumption that evolution is just blind chance, that the entire cosmos is headed nowhere, that there's no purpose in evolution, is not something that scientists have proved by rigorous experiments. It's simply an assumption, like these other assumptions. And the reason for it being an assumption is that nature's mechanical. Nature's a machine. The universe is a machine. Machines have no purpose of their own. They serve our purposes, but by themselves they have no purpose. Your car has no particular goal or destination. It will go where you want it to go. That's because it's a machine. If it were a horse, it might have its own ideas about where it wanted to go, because a horse is an organism. But machines don't have purposes of their own. Therefore, the universe has no purpose because it's a machine. Therefore, evolution is purposeless. That's all there is to it in this argument. Some people treat this as one of the most profound truths there could be about nature. It makes a lot of people very depressed. I don't think it's any coincidence that depression's a characteristic modern disease when our worldview is essentially deeply depressing. The universe is purposeless. The sixth assumption is that biological inheritance is material. Everything you inherit materially through genes or through epigenetic modifications of genes or perhaps through cytoplasmic inheritance as well. But all inheritance is essentially material because everything's material. The essential assumption of materialism is that reality is material. Matter is the only reality. That's what materialism is, the belief in matter as the only reality. So inheritance has to be material. What else could it be? The seventh assumption is that memories are stored as material traces inside your brain. That everything you remember about yesterday or where you went on holiday last year or episodes from your childhood or all the habits and skills you've learned are stored inside the brain through modified nerve endings or chemicals inside the brain. No one knows quite how. And 100 years of research has failed to reveal how it works. But nevertheless, it's almost universally taken for granted within the sciences and even outside the sciences that memories are stored as material traces inside the brain. I'll be dealing in more detail with that on my workshop on Monday. The eighth assumption is that the mind is inside the head. Mental activity is brain activity. All your mental activity is nothing but the activity of your brain, and it's therefore confined to the inside of your head. If you believe in God, for example, that's a mental activity, it's an idea. It corresponds to some small amount of electrical and chemical activity in particular regions of the brain, and God's nothing but electrochemical activity inside your brain. God doesn't exist out there. God's just a product of your mental activity inside your brain. Anyone who believes that God's out there is just naive, childish, and uneducated, because we now know, in terms of science, it's just something going on inside your brain. So the mind is inside the brain. Assumption 9 is that psychic phenomena are illusory. Phenomena like telepathy may appear to happen. Most people think they have happened in their own lives, but that's because they're just wrong about their own experience. Telepathy is impossible. It can't happen. You can't have the effect of thoughts at a distance. You can't see the future, as in precognition. These things can't happen because the mind's nothing but the brain and it's confined to the inside of the head. So any evidence for these phenomena must be illusory. Anyone who thinks they've got positive experimental evidence for them must be a charlatan or deluded in some way. And this is the position maintained by organized skeptical groups who do their best to debunk any evidence for the so-called paranormal because they believe with tremendous fervor that these things are absolutely impossible. And the 10th assumption is that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Other kinds of medicine, alternative and complementary therapies, energy medicine, etc., may appear to work. People may get better after they've been treated by such practitioners, but that's because they would have got better anyway, or it's nothing but the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is, of course, itself unexplained. But this is nevertheless the standard assumption. And again, there are skeptical organizations like Quackbusters who see it as their job to try and eradicate complementary and alternative medicine, or at least to discredit them as much as they possibly can. And again, they think they're doing this in the name of science and reason. So this is the basic belief system which most educated people have. It's not necessarily taught explicitly as a series of 10 dogmas like this, but it's absorbed implicitly in the course of years of education. Now, I think that every single one of these beliefs is false. I think that every single one of them has been superseded by the sciences themselves, and that we really need to move on from them. And what I'm going to do this evening is just talk about 2 or perhaps 3 of them, and I'll address more of these assumptions tomorrow on Sunday in my keynote address on Sunday evening and in my workshop on Monday. The one I'm going to talk about first is the idea that matter is unconscious. The sun, the stars, the galaxies, the whole universe, the intergalactic gas, the rocks, everything in the universe is made up of unconscious matter. Doesn't think, doesn't have purpose, doesn't have intentions. It's just pushed around by external forces or obeying mathematical laws of nature. Now, how do we know matter's unconscious? Well, we don't. It's an assumption. And it was an assumption built into science in the 17th century by one of the great founding fathers of modern science, René Descartes, the French philosopher. The reason the scientific revolution was a revolution was because it rejected the previous idea of nature, which everyone in Europe more or less took for granted. The previous idea of nature, taught in the medieval universities, places like Paris and Oxford and Cambridge, and in the monasteries, was that nature's animate. The earth is Mother Earth. The stars are intelligences. They have intelligences in them. Each star has its own angel or intelligence. That animals and plants are truly alive. They have souls. Plants have vegetative souls that shape their bodies, and an oak tree grows into an oak tree because the seedling is attracted towards the form of the mature oak by the soul of the oak, which shapes the body. A Joshua tree is attracted into its strange and mysterious form by the soul of the Joshua tree. Animals have 2 kinds of souls: the vegetative soul that shapes their body, that attracts the embryo towards the mature form of the animal, and in addition a soul that coordinates their movements and sensations, called the animal soul. And the reason animals are called animals is because the Latin word for soul is anima. Animals are beings with souls. And in the Middle Ages, it was believed that humans have an additional kind of soul. Humans have vegetative souls that shape the body, animal souls that give us our animal nature and our emotions and coordinate our senses in much the same way they do in animals. But in addition, we have the rational or intellectual soul that's to do with language, thought, logic, reason. And that's what's unique in humans. But this human rational soul is embedded in a larger psychic system which is largely unconscious. That was the view that the scientific revolution rejected. Descartes drained souls out of nature, so the universe, instead of being a great living organism, became a machine. Animals and plants became inanimate, soulless machines. And the human body became a soulless machine. All that was left of this medieval worldview was the human rational mind, which Descartes thought was immaterial, not in space and time, and it shared its nature with angels and God. So he divided the world into 2 realms: unconscious matter, which constitutes all of nature, and immaterial spirits or minds or consciousness, which is present in humans, angels, and God. And the 2 are completely different in nature. One lot is in space and time, the other lot are not. That's called Cartesian dualism, because it creates this sharp duality of matter and psyche, or matter and spirit. And it also created a duality, not just between body and mind, but also between humans and other animals. We have rational minds, purposes, and God-given reason, but they don't. Therefore, it's fine to treat them however we want. Descartes himself dissected dogs without anesthetic because he said it's fine if they cry out in pain. It's not really pain. It's just a mechanical sound produced by the dog. They can't feel pain. They don't have emotions. They don't think. They're machines. They're no more feeling pain than an organ feels pain when you press a note on the keyboard and it produces a sound. So it led to this division between humans and animals, and it also led to a split between science and religion. Science got the whole of nature, inanimate matter. Religion got the human spirit, angels, and God, and morality. And this enabled science and religion to coexist quite reasonably well for centuries. Still today, many scientists who are religious preserve this kind of split in their own lives. And many people still defend it. The late Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book about this, where he talked about the doctrine of non-overlapping magisteria, different realms of discussion which shouldn't interfere with each other. So this Cartesian dualism was okay as far as it went. A lot of people still accept it because it's the only way you can deal with being human and accepting material science. But in the 19th century, increasing numbers of people came to reject it. They didn't like the idea of there being two different things running the whole of nature and our lives. They wanted just one thing. And I personally think two things are too few rather than too many. I think we needed three basic principles, a kind of Trinitarian model, but I'm not talking about that this evening. Those who thought we should reduce it from two to one went in one of two directions. One group said it's all mind or spirit, and that's the philosophy of idealism. A lot of 19th century philosophers in Europe and America were idealists. Not idealists in the sense they wanted the world to be a better place, but idealists in the sense that they thought the ultimate reality was ideas or mind or consciousness. Matter was just dumbed down mind. The other group went the other way, and they said, no, this realm of spirit doesn't exist. All that exists is matter. And materialism is the philosophy that arises by deleting the spirit pole of dualism. That's how it arose historically. Now, when you do that, immediately, God and angels just vanish from the world picture. At one stroke, you get rid of all religion and all religions, all spiritual beliefs. And that's one of the reasons people became materialists. They were opposed to the power of churches or synagogues. And so the simplest way to get rid of their power was to deny the reality of God and any spiritual realm. And that's still the motive power behind scientists who are militant atheists today. The problem with this, as you immediately see, is that by denying the realm of the spirit in Cartesian dualism, then it leaves a huge question unanswered. If matter's unconscious, there's no such thing as consciousness or spirit in the universe, then how come we're conscious? We ought not to be. Human consciousness ought not to exist. We ought to be unconscious machines. So how do you deal with that? Well, materialist philosophers throughout the 20th century and still today try to deal with it by saying, well, we're not really conscious. Consciousness may exist, but it doesn't do anything. It's an epiphenomenon of the activity of the brain that doesn't do anything, like a kind of shadow. Others say, well, consciousness does exist, but it's an illusion. It's just matter, but somehow it creates this illusion of being conscious. The trouble is that doesn't explain it either, because illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So materialist philosophers go round in circles trying to explain away consciousness. The leading school of thought in Californian academic world, the Churchlands, at, I've forgotten where they are, maybe California Institute of Technology, they're called eliminative materialists because they're the most extreme form of materialists who take the view that consciousness does not exist. They're talking in terms of subjective experience. They call folk psychology that only happens because people aren't educated enough or don't know enough about science, in which case they talk just in terms of nerve impulses and brain activity. Well, all of this is obviously rather unsatisfactory. And until Until about 20 years ago, though, these schools of thought ruled the roost. But in the last 20 years, consciousness studies has become a serious and important field of scientific inquiry. And within that realm of consciousness studies, there's been increasing debate about the nature of minds. People have begun to explore consciousness through subjective states, through meditation, through psychedelic experience, the effects of mind over body, the effects of mind over healing, the placebo effect, and many other areas of inquiry. And increasingly, philosophers of mind and scientists in consciousness studies have come to see that this materialist attempt to explain away consciousness just won't do. Apart from anything else, it denies free will. And so the materialists think that everything that you think is caused by physical causation in your brain. Now, next time you have an argument with a materialist friend who tries to persuade you that they're right and materialism's right, you could ask them, why they themselves believe in materialism. They're likely to say because of science and reason. But of course, to invoke science and reason implies you have freedom of choice to respond to evidence. But actually, their philosophy says that everything they do or anyone else do, they only do because their brain makes them do it. And it's basically a self-refuting philosophy, because if you're a materialist, you can't really try and persuade anyone else to be one, because you're presupposing that your mind is free to make rational decisions and choices. What's happening at the moment is that materialists are jumping ship. They're leaving, they're defecting from this worldview. One of the leaders in this movement was Galen Strawson, a British philosopher of mind, who wrote a key paper about 5 or 6 years ago called "Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism?" And he answered yes. Now, panpsychism is the belief or doctrine or philosophy that psyche, mind, is present everywhere throughout nature. Pan means everywhere, psychism means mind or psyche. That nature, there's a kind of element of mind or psyche, even in electrons and atoms. That the argument here is that you can't have consciousness emerge in human brains unless the matter that it emerges from already has some kind of primitive form of consciousness or lower level consciousness. Otherwise, if you just say it appears miraculously when a brain reaches a certain size, it's another kind of dualism. You just have mechanism and then a kind of miraculous appearance of consciousness that's unexplained. A more recent convert to panpsychism was Thomas Nagel, the US, the America's leading philosopher of mind at Columbia in New York. And Nagel wrote a book a couple of years ago called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Now, this stirred up a furore in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and in the kind of intellectual world in America. The materialist camp, people like Steven Pinker, Daniel Dennett, and so on, were absolutely furious, and they denounced him in the most intemperate language. But Nagel's book is a very fascinating book, because here's somebody who is an atheist and was a kind of materialist, who just realizes, you see him thinking out loud in this book, and he ends up by saying we need a completely new kind of science. And what's more, we need a theory of evolution that sees purpose in the way evolution has occurred, both in life on Earth and in the cosmos. Fascinating to see this tremendous turnaround. The latest panpsychist, the person who left materialism to join the panpsychist camp, is one of the most hardcore of the materialists in California, Christoph Koch, who was at California Institute of Technology. He worked with Francis Crick on consciousness and the brain. And he came out about 6 months ago in an article in Scientific American arguing for panpsychism as the way forward. Now, this is a fascinating thing, you see, that there's the materialists, the most hardcore materialists, are going over to an idea there's some kind of mind in nature, which is not very different from animism, which is what the scientific revolution started off by rejecting, the idea of a living world, a living nature. And another straw in the wind is that Sam Harris, who's one of the so-called new atheists, one of the new atheists. In 2006, this torrent of atheist books, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, Sam Harris, The End of Faith, Daniel Dennett, Breaking the Spell, Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great, Why Religion Poisons Everything. This tsunami of atheist literature came out and sort of took over the sort of chattering classes for a while. But Sam Harris, one of these 4 new atheists, has a book coming out this week called Waking Up, Spirituality Without Religion. He's gone over to spirituality and comes out in favor of a kind of Buddhism light. And so it's a fascinating transition. We're in a time of extraordinary change at the moment. The hardcore people in the materialist camp are changing their tune. Dennett still soldiers on, maintaining the faith. In England, Richard Dawkins has become a figure of fun and is now a kind of standard figure of fun in satires and cartoons for his extreme levels of bigotry and intolerance. And so it's a very interesting moment we're in. Now, as soon as we begin to think about panpsychism, the mind within nature, within matter, we realize this is, of course, an old philosophy. It's basically what the medieval philosophy in the universities, under the influence of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, was the standard teaching in Europe. And in the 17th century, in reaction to Descartes, 2 of the leading philosophers were panpsychists. One was Leibniz, the German philosopher, who had this idea that the universe is made up of monads. Monads are self-organizing units, which could include crystals. They could also include animals and people. Each monad had a body, but also a mind or a psyche, and each monad reflected the universe from its own point of view. So the whole universe was conscious, but it was full of points of consciousness in every self-organizing system, all of them reflecting the whole universe. It's kind of holographic universe. The other panpsychist philosopher was Spinoza, and he talked in terms of nature being the body of God and God being the mind of nature. They're 2 sides of the same coin. But their philosophies were more or less forgotten or marginalized by the march of materialist science, or at least mechanical science, mechanistic science, and then in the 19th century, materialist science. The greatest panpsychist philosopher of the 20th century, and the one who I think has the most to tell us today, was Alfred North Whitehead. And Alfred North Whitehead was a British philosopher who was at Cambridge. Together with his student Bertrand Russell, he wrote a famous book, Principia Mathematica, on the logical principles of mathematics. He was a philosopher who was also a mathematician. And he was one of the first philosophers to understand and appreciate the enormous significance of quantum theory, its radical significance. In the 1920s, Whitehead immediately realized that quantum theory changed everything. The reason it changed everything was that it gave us a picture of matter, not as hard particles that just persisted in time, but as a process that involved waves. Electrons were waves. They were wave processes. Light was waves. Quanta are wave packets. So matter was wave-like, according to quantum theory. Whitehead immediately saw this meant that matter was not a thing, but a process. An electron isn't just an object that persists. It's a vibratory process that takes place in time. And this was a huge revolution, he realized. If an electron's vibrating in time, if it's waving in time, then this has a number of important implications. The first is that you can't localize a wave at an instant in space and time. Think of a wave on the Pacific Ocean. If you take a micrometer slice of a wave, you can't possibly say what wavelength it has or what kind of wave it is, because you need to have it go through a wavelength to see what the wavelength is, and that takes time, and it also takes space. So waves wave, and waving takes time. So as Whitehead pointed out, you couldn't localize a quantum particle in a particular moment or instant or space. And that, in the final analysis, is the basis of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the fact that quantum theory, as everybody knows, gives you predictions only in terms of probabilities. It's approximate, it's statistical. because you can't precisely localize waves. This means that even an electron is a process in time, and any process in time has a future pole and a past pole. The process is spread out between the future and the past. And he thought that this provided the key to understanding the interrelation of mind and body. That most of us have been brought up to think the relation of mind and body should be understood in terms of spatial metaphors, the inner life, the outer world. These are spatial metaphors. He thought that the best way to think about it was in terms of time. The mental pole of an electron is the future pole. The physical pole is the past pole. And his point was that the mental pole is concerned with possibilities. This is true in quantum physics. The Schrödinger wave equation gives you a mathematical formula that tells you all the possible things that electron could do. Richard Feynman, in his lectures on physics, made it extremely clear, and in his wonderful book on quantum electrodynamics, made it very clear that quantum theory is about possibilities. And these wave functions, these quantum phenomena, depend on the quantum particle having all these possibilities open to it until it interacts with something, and then all these possibilities collapse down to one actual outcome which you can measure. It's now a physical fact, but it's now in the past. And the possibilities which were in the future before it collapsed then start again. A whole new set of possibilities open up. Now, these, he thinks, are the mental pole. The mental pole is the realm of possibility in a virtual future, and that the mental pole of causation works from the future towards the past, whereas regular physical causation works from the past towards the future. They overlap in the present, and that's how mind and body overlap or interact. Now, the same is true of human beings. If you think about our own minds, most of our mental activity is unconscious. We're creatures of habit. Our minds work in terms of habits, habits of thought, habits of the way we speak, gestures. You know, when we get into a car and drive it, it's habitual. You don't have to think about it. You can have a conversation with somebody and you know enough about what's going on to drive the car, but you don't need to think about these things that are habitual. Much of our activity is unconscious. But our conscious minds are concerned with choices among possibilities. Consciousness is a kind of arena of possibility, and the function of our minds is to choose among these possibilities. For example, the fact that we're all in this room now is a measurable objective scientific fact. We can be photographed, weighed, measured, etc. It's a scientific objective fact. But there was a time in the past, maybe a few days in the past, maybe months in the past, when we hadn't decided to come here. We could have been in lots of different places right now. And we all made a decision to come here, and that's why we're here. But when we were thinking about whether to come here, we were thinking about other things we might have to do and all sorts of other considerations that came into our conscious minds. Then we made a decision, we implemented it. It's a physical fact that we're here. But when we were thinking about this as something in the future, those possibilities were not physical facts. They were a realm of possibility. Consciousness is about possibility. So I think Whitehead's ideas on this subject are some of the most interesting there are. And they make a certain number of predictions, some of which are testable, about the mind and the future nature of consciousness. For example, the psychologist and neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet showed that if you give someone a stimulus for 100 milliseconds, say a mild electric shock or they hear a tone, 100 milliseconds, they don't notice it. 200 milliseconds, they don't notice it. 300, they don't notice it. 400, they don't notice it. 500 milliseconds, they become consciously aware of it. But the time at which they say they became consciously aware of it was when it started. Their experience is backdated by 500 milliseconds. Now, this is a very strange result. And when you think about it in terms of the mind working backwards, as it were, in time, this is the kind of data that you can begin to think about in a new way. Now, if electrons have a kind of mind, and choose among possibilities. I'm not suggesting they're more conscious than we are. We're largely unconscious because we're largely habitual. And of course, there's a large period when we're unconscious when we're asleep. So I'm not suggesting they're much more conscious than we are. I think electrons, molecules, plants, animals are largely habitual in what they do. And if they have conscious minds, those would come into play when they have to make choices among possible actions. But it may seem a little artificial and a stretch to think about the mind of an electron. But I think where this philosophy of panpsychism becomes more interesting is when we think about big things rather than little things. And the one I like to think about most is the sun. The sun is a self-organizing system. The whole solar system is self-organizing, and so is the galaxy, which contains it. So the sun's a self-organizing system. It fits this criteria of Whitehead's about self-organizing systems that might have minds. His principle, by the way, excludes things that are not self-organizing, like machines. Machines are some of the few things in the world which this principle doesn't apply to. They don't make themselves, build themselves. They're made in factories. And so I don't think they have this same capacity. But the sun is self-organizing. No one put it together in a factory. It organized itself and still does. And therefore, it ought to have a mind on this principle. The sun should be conscious, if this philosophy is a reasonable one. Well, is the sun conscious? Now, you realize as soon as you ask that question, there's a part of you that leaps up and says, no, it can't possibly be. The sun's just a hydrogen bomb. Primitive people used to think the sun was conscious. Children think the sun's conscious. They draw it with a smiley face. But we're modern grown-ups, and we know, science has shown, that the sun is nothing but a kind of giant hydrogen bomb that works in accordance with the laws of physics. Well, indeed, it may have, it does have all these physical reactions going on within it. But does that mean it's nothing but a physical system that's unconscious? Your body has lots of physical changes going on within it which can be measured, including electrical changes in the brain. The sun has very complex electrical patterns of activity reverberating throughout the whole of the sun. Does the fact it's got physical patterns of activity going on within it proves it's nothing but physics and it's unconscious? Of course not. The question is completely open. So the idea that the sun's unconscious is just an assumption. It's part of the assumption that matter is unconscious. All traditional people have thought the sun is conscious. They've thought it's a god or a goddess. The Japanese think it's a goddess. The Greeks thought of it as a god, Apollo. The Indians think of it as a god, Surya, the sun god. The Indians have, in India, all sorts of exercises that relate to the sun. The Surya Namaskar, the prostration to the sun, it's a yoga exercise that millions of people do. I do it myself. Then there's the Gayatri mantra, which is one of the most fundamental mantras of India, which invokes the splendor and power of the sun, the divine radiance of the sun to illuminate our meditation. So maybe the sun is conscious. And if the sun's conscious, then the stars, the other stars, are conscious too by the same reasoning. And maybe the entire galaxy has a great galactic mind that includes all the stars and solar systems within it, like cells in the body. Maybe the galactic mind may be centered in the galactic center at the heart of our galaxy, and every galaxy. There seems to be a center of huge activity that sends vast jets of electricity and magnetic field lines streaming through the galactic arms. This great center of activity may be like the brain of the galaxy. Well, if the sun's conscious, what's it think about? With a few friends, I organized a small symposium in England some years ago called Is the Sun Conscious? And we had solar physicists, mythology experts, psychologists, and we were discussing, is the sun conscious? We decided we couldn't actually fully decide yes or no, but we decided that let's assume it is and let's think what it thinks about. So one thing it would think about is the solar system, which is its body. It's like the brain of the solar system. And the sun's electromagnetic field is the basis of all life on Earth. It permeates us now. Everything that's happening on Earth is happening within the electromagnetic field of the sun. The electrical changes going on in your brain are within the sun's electromagnetic field. Its life on Earth depends on the light from the sun through photosynthesis. And the sun, I'm not suggesting the sun can make conscious choices about its orbit. That may well be determined by laws of physics or habits of physics. But it has a great deal of activity going on. It sends out flares and coronal mass ejections and has sunspot cycles, which sometimes don't happen very much at the moment. We're in a sunspot cycle minimum. And when it has a coronal mass ejection or a flare that's going to happen, wherever it points it could have huge effects. If it points it at California, there'd be massive power outages and complete chaos, maybe for months, because a really big one would cause all the power line transformers to blow out. There would be massive effects. That's why NASA runs a space weather report that affects life on Earth, radio transmissions, communication satellites. The sun can push things around on Earth in a big way if it wants to. And so the sun may well be thinking about its body, the whole solar system, including the Earth. But a part of its mind, like part of our minds, may also be socially engaged as it relates to its peer group, the other stars within the galaxy. And we don't know what stars and galaxies think about. And, you know, if there's a galactic mind, what are galactic thoughts like? Well, this is a new area of speculation. This is not something that traditional physics has spent more than a second or two on dismissing. It's not an area that traditional religions have devoted much time to either. They certainly have the idea of an animate being of the cosmos, that there's intelligences and so on in the cosmos, that it's full of living beings. When medieval Europeans, Christian or Jewish or Arabs looked out in the sky, or Indians, what they saw was a sky permeated with the consciousness of God, with stars as living beings, with intelligences in each one, and in the planets, of course. We still call them by the names of gods and goddesses, Mercury, Venus, Mars, etc. When a modern person looks out in the sky, they see a meaningless expanse of space with hydrogen bombs located in it, moving in accordance with laws of gravitation, entirely unconscious. So you see, it makes a big difference. It's a shift in thinking. I don't know how yet it could transform astronomy and cosmology, but I mention this as one of the areas where thinking differently about matter could have huge consequences for the way we see the world. There's nothing in science that prohibits this. It's simply an assumption that it's all unconscious. And it's not as if science has been brilliantly successful in understanding consciousness. Most of its history has been involved in denying consciousness. So that's one of the open questions. I don't have time to deal with more than one other at the moment. I shall be talking about the laws of nature as habits in biological inheritance as a kind of collective memory, memory as a resonant phenomenon on Monday. On Sunday evening, I'm talking about the extended mind, the way our minds extend so far beyond our brains, and the ways in which psychical phenomena like telepathy occur and what underlies them. But what I'm going to talk about now is the assumption that the amount of matter and energy in the universe are fixed. This is the assumption of the 10 dogmas that I myself questioned last and didn't really question until I was writing this book. I realized it was one of the 10 basic dogmas, but I thought that maybe this one was true. I actually quite wanted one of them to be true, because otherwise I might have seemed biased if I said they're all false. So I would have been quite happy to find this was true, but the more I thought about it and the more I read about it, the more I realized that this is probably one of the most unsustainable of all the assumptions. The idea that the total amount of matter and energy in the universe is always the same arose originally as a theological and a philosophical idea. In ancient Greece, one of the schools of thought were the materialists. The materialists in ancient Greece were opposed to Aristotle and Plato and the other schools of thought on exactly the same grounds as materialists today are. The ancient Greek materialists were atheists. They wanted to get rid of the gods. And the best way to get rid of the gods was to say everything's matter. There's no such thing as invisible forces out there that make decisions and think and have emotions and do things. It's just matter. And they said that matter was made up of lots of little bits, atoms, which by definition couldn't be split up, moving around in the void. So all of matter, all of reality was just atoms being pushed around by forces in the void. That's atomism. And because atoms by definition couldn't be broken up, the total amount of atoms remained the same. Therefore, the total amount of matter was always the same. This was implicit in their view. In the 17th century, with the scientific revolution, the idea of a mechanical universe, there was a revival of atomism, and people said, well, the universe consists of a fixed amount of matter put there by God at the initial creation of the universe, but thereafter unchanging. So the principle of conservation of matter is rooted in this kind of philosophical and theological argument. The amount of energy, in the 17th century, it was thought that God made the universal machine and then started it in motion. He designed it, intelligently designed it like an engineer, and then started it going. And that the movement in nature, all the movement of the stars and the planets and everything that moves, the wind and the tides and so on, were part of this initial God-given movement to the universe. And because this movement was God-given, it was essentially divine, and the total amount couldn't change because it was God-given. That was why people originally thought the total amount of motion was the same. In the mid-19th century, with the foundation of thermodynamics in the 1850s, the first law of thermodynamics said that the total amount of energy is always the same. Matter and energy are neither created nor destroyed. The total amount of energy is conserved. It was a brilliant unifying theory because it said that all the different kinds of energy in nature are interconvertible. Heat, light, work, mechanical work, chemical energy, all these different kinds of energy could flow into one another. There was a kind of universal energy underlying the whole of nature. That's a really interesting and I think profound conception, and one of the great insights of 19th century science. But the assumption that the total amount was always the same was that. It was just that. It was an assumption. And it became so built into the foundations of science that nowadays no one sees fit to question it, except physicists. Interestingly, in the 1980s, physicists, who are less frightened by the laws of physics than other people, because they're, after all, the people who make them up, or at least codify them, they came across an anomaly they couldn't explain, that in the galaxies, the stars are revolving around the centers of galaxies far too fast to be explained by the gravitational force of the galaxy. And different galaxies are attracting each other too strongly to be explained by the amount of matter within them in terms of gravitation. If you add up all the matter in the stars, gas clouds, put in a generous allowance for planets and brown dwarfs and black holes and so on, there isn't enough matter in galaxies to explain the way the stars are moving within them or the way galaxies attract each other. So there are two possible conclusions. One is that the theory of galaxies is wrong, that galaxies are organized not just by gravitation, but by something else. Maybe if they have a mind and they're a body and embodied, they have psyche and matter, and the galactic mind organizes them in a particular way. You don't need to explain it all in terms of gravity. But they didn't want to think about that sort of thing. They wanted to explain it in terms of gravity. Not enough matter to explain it. So how do you deal with that? Well, simple. You say that there must be forms of matter not yet detected that are actually there and explain what's going on. And it's dark matter because you haven't seen it. You've got no other evidence for it. It must be there. How much dark matter? Well, exactly the right amount you need to make the equations balance. You can titrate in as much dark matter as you want till you've got the whole system to work perfectly. And they say, well, there must be that amount of dark matter. And if a galaxy's got an unexpected bulge somewhere, then you say, well, there must be a sort of bulge of dark matter there that's pulling it out. You can explain everything with this dark matter. The only trouble is that it's never been detected independently, and no one has a clue what it is. There's a lot of speculative theories about it, but it's utterly unknown. There's about 5 times as much as ordinary matter, according to this theory. Having added all that extra matter into the universe, it meant the universe should have more gravitation than it had done previously. That meant that it should be pulling itself back into the expanding universe should be slowing down, and it should stop expanding and then begin to contract again till it contracted faster and faster, and everything ended in the reverse of the Big Bang, known in the trade as the Big Crunch. This cosmology was the dominant one in the 1990s. But in 2000, it was discovered that the most distant galaxies are not slowing down at the edges of the universe, as this theory would predict. They're speeding up. The universe is expanding faster and faster as time goes on. So how on earth can you explain that? Well, simple. There must be another kind of energy that's pushing everything apart. And what is it? Well, it's dark energy. The total amount of dark matter and dark energy is now believed to constitute 96% of the universe. The matter and energy you learned about at school in physics and chemistry classes is only 4% of reality. This room is full of dark energy and dark matter, but we don't know what they are or why they're there or anything about them. But they're the basis of our modern cosmology. It's as if cosmology has discovered the kind of universal unconscious. 96% of reality is utterly unknown to us, and it shapes the destiny of what's actually happening. We don't know what it is, how it works, or what it's made up of. That's the state of play in contemporary cosmology. So can we be sure that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same? Well, no, the amount of matter and energy recognized by physics has increased 20-fold within our lifetimes. No one's got terribly upset about that. People haven't jumped up and down and said, you can't do this to the physicists. They can do what they like when it comes to matter and energy. And so there's also, in quantum theory, something called the quantum vacuum field or the zero-point field. As Richard Feynman shows so brilliantly in his book Quantum Electrodynamics, QED it's called, whenever electrons interact with things, the only reason you can get the equations to balance is by assuming that they're interacting with virtual particles that arise from the quantum vacuum all the time. All electrical and material interactions are now explained in terms of the quantum vacuum. Underneath each one of your bottoms at the moment, there's a force which is stopping you going through your chair. That force is an electrical repulsion between the material of your bottom and the clothes and the material of the chair. That electrical repulsion, which is why you're not going through the chair, is mediated by virtual photons. Out of the quantum vacuum field, vast clouds of virtual photons are coming into being and disappearing again into the quantum vacuum under your bottom, and that's why you're not falling through the chair. This is standard physics. When you stand up, that cloud that was between your bottom and the chair disappears, and a much stronger cloud appears beneath your feet as you stand, stopping you going through the floor. The world is full of energy. This quantum vacuum field, which is like an ocean of energy on which the amount of matter we know floats on the surface, like waves on the surface of an ocean. Again, I emphasize this is standard modern physics. This is the basis of contemporary quantum theory. So could this dark energy, could this quantum vacuum field, this enormous amount of energy, a teaspoon of which would be enough to power the United States for years, can it be tapped? Could we actually draw on this energy? Is that possible? Well, some people think it is. There are a lot of people who've invented gadgets or devices that are supposed to produce more energy than you put into them. They're called above unity devices because they give more energy than you put into them. The amount you put in is take that as one, they produce like 2 or 3 times as much energy. Or sometimes they're sometimes called free energy devices. Now, as soon as anyone proposes that they've got one of these, one of the oldest taboos in science comes into play, the taboo against perpetual motion machines, which was put into science in the 17th century by Galileo. And ever since then, there's been a tremendous taboo against this possibility. So, although these inventors claim they've got these gadgets, and although they give demonstrations, and they're filmed, and they're on YouTube, and there are whole websites devoted to this kind of thing, as soon as you get to a regular physics department, they're met with nothing but scorn and derision. Impossible, perpetual motion cranks, totally inconceivable, etc. Do they really work or not, these gadgets? Well, I'd love to know, and I suppose you'd love to know. Some of the people promoting them may be fraudulent, some of them may be misguided, but some of them may work. I've seen some myself that I think do work. But it's very difficult to get governments to invest in them or big corporations, because as soon as they ring up their physics consultant, professor at a university, they'll say, don't touch it with a barge pole, these people are cranks, it's completely impossible, you'll be made a fool of, etc. Here's a taboo which may be holding back vitally important technologies that would, of course, transform the world as we know it. I myself would love to know the answer, and what I'd do if I were extremely rich is set up $1 million prize for the best free energy device or above unity device, have them fairly tested by proper qualified engineers and physicists, and if any of them work, then give them the prize, and that would help get investment flowing in their direction. If none of them work, then none of them would get the prize. And the skeptics and the conventional scientists would all say, I told you so. But at least we'd have evidence that they're right in that case. They ought to welcome something like this, because it would actually put to an empirical test something that they believe. They could test their own belief in this way. Well, I don't know whether these things will work or not, but I do think that they're being held back by a kind of dogmatic frame of mind within the sciences. Now, it turns out that there are great discrepancies in the energy balance of living organisms. It's simply assumed that we obey the standard laws of energy conservation. But when an American scientist called Paul Webb in the 1970s did very careful measurements of human energy in calorimeters where people would live for days, and they measured all the air, oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, feces, urine, etc., he found there were huge discrepancies. People who were overweight and not doing much exercise they were using 25% too little energy. Energy was somehow vanishing from them. And for people who were not eating much and doing a lot of exercise, they were getting something like 25% too much energy that they shouldn't have had from their food. There's stories all over the world of people who live without food for many, many years. Inedia is the technical name for this, eating without food. There are breatharians who claim to eat without food. There are holy men in India who claim to eat without food, some of whom have been quite rigorously tested and found to be genuine. There are saints throughout the Christian West who've said to have lived without food. There are holy men in India and China, and holy women too, the whole of that is simply dismissed as a fantasy, as if we know that the energy balances are totally accounted for in terms of standard accounting. The evidence shows that they're not. And there are great mysteries here. And it's not as if nutrition science is the most successful branch of modern science. A third of the world's population are obese or overweight, and nutritionists, it changed their fashions. You know, at one time, it's all fats to blame. Now it's carbohydrates and sugars. I think that's more realistic myself. But it's not as if this is one of the most rigorous and best tested areas of science. Traditions in India and China where they speak of other kinds of energy, chi or prana, are simply waved aside as meaningless superstitions. But maybe they're right. Maybe there are other kinds of energy on which we're drawing. Maybe the entire nutritional edifice that we've been brought up on is seriously limited. It's not totally wrong, but there may be serious gaps in this understanding. I don't have time to do any more, but I've just talked of two of these doctrines. Matter is unconscious, and the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. And I hope you get the point that when you question these things, when you think about them, it doesn't destroy science, it destroys scientific assumptions. But what it does is open up completely new areas for scientific inquiry. And I think that if we move beyond these dogmas of materialism, the sciences will become more scientific, more interesting. I think they'll be regenerated, and they'll probably be a lot cheaper as well. Thank you.